It is barely 3 weeks from the last election, but major political parties still run focus groups. They pay research companies to find out what voters are thinking and feeling, even this far away from the next election. So I want to bring in RedBridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, great to see you. And we're talking to you in the context of not only the election result, but also the Victorian election fast approaching and the New South Wales election fast approaching. So with the research that you're doing, how interested are state directors about what the federal election means for them?
Yeah, I can tell you there's not only sort of focus group and polling research going on, but there's a lot of what we call booth analysis and these sorts of things happening where state directors and parties and local candidates even start to sort of map out the implication of the votes in the booths that would sit within their electorates at a state level. There's always a bit of danger around doing that because it doesn't always translate one-to-one because they are different, federal versus state, but it gives you a bit of a lead on sort of broad sentiment and trend. But I think the main thing that would be sort of, I think, animating, worrying them a little bit right now is not just the vote that we saw for independents and minor parties in the federal election, but this residual and sort of spreading out kind of attitude that we're seeing around independents and minors, where a lot of folk, including folk who didn't necessarily vote for them this time around, are sort of welcoming this increase of independents and minor parties in the federal parliament. So there's an interesting sort of little shift going of sort of concern around, minor parties, independents causing a bit of, delay or instability in Parliament to a lot of folk are now looking at that and going, gee, that we think that's a good outcome for the country.
Yeah, interesting. So is the jury still out in terms of, voters being the jury, is the jury still out on whether that is good for the country, or have many made up their mind and think it absolutely is?
Yeah, it's one of those double-edged swords. I would describe it as there's a hope, there's an optimism around it that it will be good for the country. We're kind of used to seeing around independence where people tend to vote for them, and that sort of selection of independents tends to be around. Like in country areas, I think they'll advocate really well for my community, or maybe in other areas, I just personally have a sort of values disconnect or don't like that particular major party candidate, so we vote independent or minor party, or issues like environment, those sorts of things with Greens. What we're seeing here is people thinking, as I say, so hoping, optimism, that this will actually be good for the governance of the country, that they think this will push government of either stripes, but in this case, Labor government federally, will push them to be better.
Yeah.
So the flip side of that, without running the risk of sounding like an old curmudgeon, is that high expectations in politics brings its own dangers.
It certainly does. Yep. It certainly does. What about the state elections? Let's delve a little bit more into that. How worried should the two major parties be about this advent of independence a bigger influence of independence in state politics?
Yeah, I think both have their real challenges here, and I think both would be concerned about it. The teal, if I can use that term, the teal threat is very real. In electorates, particularly, so thinking of the Victorian election and those electorates in the east of Melbourne. If you look at those booth overlays there, the idea of a similar style, a similar positioned teal independent in those areas would cause significant problems for the Liberals. But equally out in the west and the north of Melbourne, Labor's got its problems. And, I'd sort of describe it as a well-resourced, well-structured centre-right type independent or even a minor party candidate in some of those seats in the west and the north of Melbourne would cause real problems for the Andrews government. And it's a similar sort of story in New South Wales. The geography might be varied a little bit, but where you've got those inner to middle suburban seats like we've seen here in the federal election. And if you do those overlays, I mean, you start then talking about some pretty significant candidates like Brad Hazzard's seat would be one that they'd be worried if a teal candidate was to run.
Yep, I think there's worry all round. We'll see where that all ends up, Simon. Great to check in with you. We'll see you soon.
All right, thanks, Laura.